If you had 60 seconds every dawn to send a single sentence back to yesterday, what truth would you dare to speak? The lighthouse at Pedra Clara did not blink like other lighthouses. At 5:14 a.m., 1 minute before the light opened the world, it exhaled a low seabell kind of sound, and a hairline seam appeared in the lantern room, thin as the slit in an envelope, bright as a kept promise. Locals said it was old wind looking for the door. Keepers knew better. It was mail. Through that narrow seam, time accepted short postcards, one sentence only, and carried them to a yesterday just close enough to touch. No attachments, no P.S., no bargains. One honest sentence per dawn, and it had to be light enough to slip through without tearing the fabric that came after. Helena inherited the lighthouse when her father's hands remembered the ocean more clearly than they remembered his own body. She arrived on a winter morning with 2 suitcases, a kettle, a blue-covered notebook, and a secret certainty that she would never again set foot in that town after the divorce. The lighthouse, however, did not ask how many certainties fit inside a suitcase. It had its own work to do, and its own way of teaching people to stay. She found the seam on the 3rd day by accident. She was scribbling a list: buy bulbs, replace door gasket, learn to bake a decent loaf, when the low hush rolled through the lantern room, wail slow, wide enough to lean on. The seam brightened from the inside out, and a yellowing note slid onto the floor in her father's handwriting. If the seam has opened, you're sad enough to use it. Don't waste the sadness. Write 1 sentence a day, only one. The kind you could carry in a pocket and still feel its weight. Helena had left home swearing never to speak to the past again, but the body often obeys before the mind does. She tore a page from the blue notebook, bit the pen cap the way she had as a girl, and wrote. It was love, truly. She fed the sentence into the seam and heard, on the far side, a sound only letters know. The lighthouse stood still. The morning opened its eye. She laughed, shocked to find there was laughter left. The next day, she woke earlier. At 5:14, the lighthouse breathed. She wrote, learn to sleep without lighting the whole house. Sent it. Then, coffee tastes better if you grind a bean that would make fun of you. Sent it. Then, you are not the plaque of the mistake you made. Sent. That was the rule. 1 sentence that could fit in a minute's mouth and somehow slip into a particular yesterday that needed it. She never knew exactly who received the words or how, but by late afternoon, sweeping the gallery, she'd find tiny seams mended in the town's fabric. A fisherman stopped cursing the motor and hummed instead. A girl let her laugh finish instead of biting it. The grocer set a jar of flowers on the coldest part of the counter for reasons she couldn't explain. Something had shifted, no praise required. The lighthouse became confessor and courier. Helena, stubbornly analog, learned to measure language like flour, by eye and weather and the hunger of whoever was going to eat. Sometimes the sentence came from her. Sometimes it felt like the sea loaned it to her hand. One dawn she wrote to her own yesterday, you don't need to win to deserve oxygen. Another morning she wrote to the boy she'd watched practicing a trumpet solo alone in the square. The note that cracks is a map, not a verdict. A week later he played at the bandstand, missed the high E like a glorious firework, and the crowd applauded with their whole bodies as if they recognized courage for the first time. People began to change without knowing why, like plants turning their faces toward a sun they couldn't see. Helena kept herself invisible. Good stewardship is half invisibility, and stored the sentences that returned stamped, too late. Try something else. It hurt to learn some words do not cross, that certain cloth tears easily, that yesterday is proud too. But it hurt in the right place, the muscle we use when we decide to continue. On a high-wind night, a 12-year-old knocked with sea-washed eyes and a backpack that was empty but heavy. Is this where you send messages to yesterday? He asked, as if borrowing a match. 1 sentence only, Helena said. He breathed like he was lifting the world by its handle. Right. Dad, it was true. I saw you cry. I won't use that against you. She wrote slowly so she wouldn't misspell any courage. She pressed the paper into the seam and squeezed his hand. He left with straighter shoulders. Next day, his father came to the grocery unshaven and bought 2 apples. 2. The first apples anyone had bought that winter. The woman in a green dress arrived scented like a city and looking like someone who had come home from a private war. I want to send Don at Mary in a hurry just to not be alone. Helena smiled, trimming the paper's corner like she was pruning a tree. That sentence wants the future, not yesterday, but send it anyway. Yesterday will keep it for you. The small sentences stitched the village together, fine thread underfoot. The fisherman stopped bullying his old radio. The girl stopped measuring her laughter. The grocer's jar became a plant nobody knew who had brought. The trumpeter missed notes on purpose now, proof that he had survived his fear of them. The widow at the corner house waited on Wednesdays just to ask the mailman about his knee. Ridiculous, enormous things. Helena noticed some dawns required extra courage. The seam widened, the light took on a different tone, like a hand on a shoulder, and the lighthouse seemed to ask her to write to herself years earlier to one of those todays that repeat if you don't interrupt them lovingly. The divorce took a long time to make it onto paper because separations follow the clocks of fear. One of those dilated mornings she wrote, "You didn't fail, you self-rescued." When she fed it through, the lighthouse made a tiny approving click. Nobody rang the church bell on time that day, and yet the old men still gathered for dominoes. Felt like it, one said, and that served as liturgy. Not every sentence belonged to earthquakes. Many were about bread that shouldn't sink, a plant that wanted less water, a dress that could be lent without turning into debt, apologies that could be folded into 3 words. You were right. Helena collected the crumbs of small miracles. A good morning spoken by the mouth's kind side. A dog that stopped barking at thunder because someone wrote, "It is okay to be afraid." A teacher who exchanged the test for a 1-hour conversation. Then, one windless dawn, the seam opened early. 5:12. The lighthouse never rushed its kindness. The light came calm but firm, like someone entering with soup. No paper slid through. An object did, a large nacreous shell with a faint spiral line. When Helena held it to her ear, she didn't hear the ocean. She heard her own voice from 5 years earlier saying, "Maybe I could stay." She sat on the cold concrete floor like a child falling into a parent's lap and wept without preamble. The shell told and untold memories, revealing versions she had not dared to live. The longer visit with her mother, the talk with her sister with shields off, the no said a week sooner. It didn't feel like judgment, it felt like cartography. "Maybe I could stay," she repeated now. She rose, made coffee and wrote, "Stay where your breathing doesn't have to apologize." Fed it through. The lighthouse seemed to nod. Word of the letter-sending lighthouse traveled the way rain begins. Rumor like mist first, then certainty like wet sleeves. More sentences arrived asking for more sentences. Helena, guardian of brevity, gently defended the rule. 1 per dawn, make it honest. Some tried their luck with lottery numbers, stock tips, revenge poems. The lighthouse returned them stamped, "Not this." Others never showed up but started sweeping their own sidewalk with shy joy. Miracles prefer anonymity. On her father's birthday, she climbed with a small cake and an old photo to the lantern room. She set the frame facing the seam. "You always laughed at the way I blew out candles," she said. "You said I held my smile and the flame grew instead of going out." At 5:14 she wrote, "I didn't follow your job, but I follow your way of caring. Invisible, persistent, stubborn." She sent it and felt a warm current like a door opening in a soup-smelling house. A man from away arrived in a too precise suit, carrying a notebook with columns. "I invest in experiences. I hear you have a differential product." He spoke as if selling bottled sunlight. He wanted to buy the lighthouse, to turn the sentences into a subscription service, to build a platform that delivered micro tomorrows in real time. He promised a new plaza, team sponsorships, billboards. The town had already spoken with its own yesterday. It smiled without contempt and said no. For him, Helena wrote, Not every miracle scales. She sent it. He left waving a goodbye that sounded like relief. Around then, a man with rain beard began showing up 2 minutes before the seam. He sat off to the side with a thick notebook, writing down the nothing. One morning, he introduced himself. Miguel, librarian of echoes. Helena raised an eyebrow. I made that up just now. Still fits. He asked questions that didn't want to be right, only wanted to hear what the answers sounded like. They became friends. When they finally kissed, it happened on the gallery while the wind tried to push the kiss away and then left them alone out of respect. That dawn she wrote, "There's no rush to finish what's already whole," and fed it to the seam like a slice of peach. Winter elbowed the windows. The seam grew temperamental. Some days it didn't open. Others it narrowed to a slit thin as a syllable. The town, now literate in wonder, did not force it. They learned to talk to their now directly. The grocer kept the flowers in place with or without mail. The trumpet player cracked notes for sport. The boy who had written to his father returned with improbable beard and height, leading his father by the elbow to buy 3 apples. 3, he said, and they both laughed. On the morning the seam decided to say goodbye, the lighthouse exhaled a quieter hush than usual, as if the sea had laid its head on stone. 5:14. Helena climbed with empty hands. She waited. The seam opened one last time, and instead of paper it showed the whole town reflected from the day before. The square before the broom. The bandstand with the flyer still askew, a child still crying before the held embrace. Over everything, written in wind calligraphy, a sentence with no signature. Be what you've been sending. Helena laughed the laugh that keeps a little of a parent's salt. She went downstairs and knocked on the neighbor's door, the one always naming her pain like weather, and offered coffee. She wrote on a napkin, "I'll come back tomorrow to hear the rest." Later, she hung a poster in the square. Post office closed. Service transferred to all of us. Under it, she strung a clothesline with wooden pins and set out a basket with blank slips and pens. People began hanging sentences for their own yesterdays. Ridiculous, enormous things. Start physio. Stop speaking badly about the body that carries you. Fry the fish low and slow. Text Duda. Forgive Jose from 1999. One clothesline wasn't enough. They hung another, and another. The wind delighted in reading everything in secret. Helena noticed how the work had changed her. She no longer mistook exhaustion for fate. Sometimes she still woke at 5:14 from habit and listened to the ordinary breath of a building at peace. She kept the shell by the kettle. On anxious nights, she held it to her ear and listened to a version of her life that could still cross the room. The lighthouse blinked on schedule now, provincial and perfect. The town lived by sentences they'd learned to give themselves. Presence had replaced postage. But time loves to test its students. A storm that had been assembling on distant water arrived with a shoulder-breaking wind and a tide that bit the stairs. Phones went dark. Roof tiles skipped like flat stones. At 3:02 a.m., someone pounded on the door, the old corner widow's voice thin, but firm. "The sea is in my kitchen." Helena and Miguel went with ropes and a light. The streets were sloshing with salt and panic. Neighbors yelled names. Names answered. They waited, lifted, tied, laughed where laughter could keep fear from shaking the hands. And when they reached the widow's door, the 3 of them stood for a second, breathing together. "Say it," the widow told Helena. "Your sentence." Helena wanted to send something back through the seam that no longer opened. Instead, she put her mouth near the woman's ear and said, "We are already here." It was enough to loosen everyone's shoulders. They leaned into the night until the water remembered it belonged elsewhere. Morning came bruised and bright. The square was a salt map of footprints and swept-out hearts. People hugged, argued kindly about where to stack the driftwood, shared bread. Helena wrote a sentence for the first page of her next notebook. "When the miracle leaves, you become the postmark." She nodded at the lighthouse like you might nod at a retired captain. "We've got it," she told it. The light winked back, a practical blink. Years expanded and softened. The trumpet player taught children to dignify wrong notes. The boy with the apples now ran the grocery and wrote tiny truths on paper bags. The widow kept a blue mug on her windowsill and filled it with the weather, which she poured back out as stories. The town's new tradition stood firm. Every week, someone who had once hung a sentence on the square returned to read it aloud and say what happened next. They never clapped. They said, "We heard you." And love, ordinary, stubborn love, kept finding Helena. Some evenings, she and Miguel cooked in companionable quiet, garlic arguing with olive oil, steam fogging the window until the world blurred into kindness. They kept the porch light warm for wandering neighbors. They took turns falling apart in soft, honest ways, so the other could practice holding without fixing. When grief visited, the kind that never runs out of tickets, they made soup and invited it to sit at the table, where it behaved. One late summer dawn, years after the seam had closed, Helena woke at 5:14 to a wind that sounded like memory learning how to hum. No light split the wall, no shell spoke. Just the ordinary dark, a kettle ticking as it cooled, and an ache that felt like gratitude trying to find shoes. She went up to the lantern room anyway, out of respect. The glass was clean. The horizon, a careful blue. She breathed and thought of all the sentences she de-sent, and the better ones that had been brought back to her by the people she loved. She thought of the boy who taught his father to cry without shame, the woman in the green dress who did not marry in a hurry, and did not end up alone, the apples that had introduced themselves to winter. Helena took the blue notebook, now swollen with ocean air and stories, and wrote to her present self, "You keep lit things that are not lamps." She smiled at the ordinary glory of it. She sliced bread, finely baked well, spread butter like a short letter, carried 2 plates to where Miguel pretended to sleep. He opened one eye and took the toast. "It was love, truly," he said with his mouth full. "It is," she said. "If, someday, you wake with the sense that time is on your side for a minute, don't waste it on brilliant sentences. Look for the plainest truth, the kind that fits in a pocket and presses on the right place. Tell someone you stayed. Tell yourself you can rest. Tell the hurt part of you that it hurt and that you're here anyway. The seam, when it wants to, opens everywhere courage does. The lighthouse at Pedra Clara still blinks, now at ordinary hours. And sometimes, on the bluest days, someone swears they hear, in the 5:14 hush, the low thud of letters arriving. Maybe it's an illusion. Maybe it's only wind. But in this town, something remains. People have learned to be the mail carriers of their own time. That may be the least grand and most necessary miracle of all, the moment you realize tomorrow really does get better, when today starts telling the truth in a quiet voice.